Hey everybody, I am your host today, and today we're reporting from CPAC, and I have with me Chloe Cole. She's a senior fellow at the medical watchdog group Do No Harm, and they focus on different youth gender ideology issues. Chloe Cole herself is a detransistor, and following that experience, she became a spokesperson to speak out against different trans issues. I'm so glad you took the time today to speak with us, and how I know you've been not campaigning, but speaking a lot to this issue. So for those who don't know you, can you give us a little bit of an introduction about your story, who you are, and how you ended up where you're at?
So I have spent the last 3 years of my life speaking out about some things that have happened to me, especially in regards to this issue. I am a detransitioner, meaning that I'm somebody who once identified as transgender, and I actually went through the medical motions of it, and I came back out of it. I re-identify with my birth sex now, and I have stopped going on this path. I went through all of this when I was a child, actually. So at 12 years old, I decided that I was going to be a young man and that I was going to embark on this path. And at 13, the medical process began for me with a drug called Lupron, and which is it's previously been used for mitigating like really early onset puberty, or for like people who have like reproductive issues, or it's also been used to chemically castrate sex offenders, and they're putting me on this to stop my puberty as a perfectly healthy child. And very soon after the injections of that started, I was put on weekly injections of testosterone to masculinize my body, my face, my voice, and make me appear more like a young man. At 15 years old, I had my first and only surgery, which was a double mastectomy to get rid of my breast. And at 16 was when I realized that all of this was causing damage to my body, that it was taking away parts of my adulthood while I was still a child, that I wanted to have children one day, and that this potentially could have taken away my ability to do that. So I decided to detransition.
It's so overwhelming, and to even hear this to have happened to you. I want to review the timeline, just because all of this happened at such a young age, and I think that's part of how big, what makes this such a big issue. So you started your transition, I think you said at 12, and this is before you got on Lupron on 13. Before taking Lupron, what did the transition look like? And can you express a little bit of your emotions and why you maybe went down this path? What happened at that age to, I guess, make you start to think maybe I do need to start transitioning before you even got to Lupron?
So I began with a social transition, which basically consists of changing your name and the way that you refer to yourself as, usually calling yourself the opposite sex and asking people to do the same for you, and I asked people to refer me by male pronouns. Actually, I never asked people to I never played with the whole pronoun game, because at the time, it was kind of a different transgender community. It wasn't as entitled. It was just if you pass, you pass. If people don't call you that, then you're not working hard enough.
You weren't giving people a hard time for misgendering.
No, I was not. I was not one of those. But where these feelings originated from for me were, a lot of it was just normal pubertal distress. I was going through puberty a little bit early. I started developing when I was 8 years old in 3rd or 4th grade. So I was one of the first of my peers to start looking like a young woman. And with that came a lot of uncomfortable attention and just the discomfort that comes with going through female puberty. And I was also a bit of a tomboy. I felt like I had a hard time kind of associating with my female peers or role models, but there's nothing really particularly about the ordinary, out of the ordinary for either of those things. Although I did have some sexual trauma. I had been assaulted a few times during my early adolescence. And I was diagnosed with a learning disability, and it's strongly suspected that I might be on the autistic spectrum somewhere. But I didn't really understand why I felt like I was different from the other kids around me. I always thought differently, I always behaved differently, I was kind of an outside-the-box thinker, and I thought that all of these things just made it so that there is something wrong with me.
Absolutely. Did you meet with any therapists before deciding to do your social transition, or did you come about this on your own? What made you decide to do the social transition?
So I never actually believed that I was a boy until I started encountering the online transgender community. And it was just full of other kids who were just like me. They were unique, they were creative, many of them were tomboys or perhaps more effeminate boys while growing up. And they all had identity issues just like I had, and yet it seemed to be mitigated by pursuing a transition. And I was interested not only in the personal stories of these other kids, but also like the medical literature around some of this, because I was kind of a weird kid, and I feel like it's probably not normal for a kid to be reading stuff like that. But there was the two parts of it that really sucked me in, and what really did it for me was this theory that people who are transgender, people who identify as transgender or experience gender dysphoria, actually have a condition that makes it so that they have the brain of the opposite sex. Now, this has since been debunked, but I didn't know that at the time. I just thought, like, oh, this explains all of the negative feelings that I experienced around being female, and now I finally understand myself. So I started to take on a social transition before I went to therapy, and it was actually my mom and dad who decided to send me to therapy, because when I told them about these feelings, they didn't really quite understand it, but they really felt for me. And they wanted me to feel okay in my own skin and help me to feel comfortable. But they never believed that I was a boy or anything. They just wanted to get me maybe further psychiatric help, because they didn't really get what was going on, but they could see that it was like a psychiatric thing.
I'm kind of curious, what parts of the internet was this, like Reddit or I don't know, Tumblr, TikTok, where you were getting some of this information that made you feel this way? Or?
Yeah, it was primarily Instagram. This was in the pre-TikTok era. But there was some overlap with Tumblr, which is where a lot of like the modern transgender movement and ideology originate from. There was like a lot of cross-posting between these two platforms, so I was exposed to like a lot of that culture.
And I'm trying to understand, so you eventually saw your parents sent you to therapy. What happened in those therapy sessions? Did they affirm what you were confused about as a child, or how did those go?
Yeah, it was basically affirmation only. There was no real questioning of where these feelings came from. And whenever I would talk about some of my negative feelings around like my body, around my breasts or puberty, it was basically just treated it as a consequence of me being born in the wrong body and supposedly being a young man. And they just kept saying, yes, you are a young man. Yes, we're going to refer to you by your preferred name. And we are going to make sure that your parents do the same thing. Now, my mom and dad, they were completely in the dark during this time, because they were not allowed to be in the room, actually, during these appointments. This is standard practice in California, actually, because we have a law that makes it so that minors at the age of 12 are emancipated when it comes to pursuing or being in seeking psychological help. So a minor can seek therapy, speak to a psychologist without either the consent or knowledge of their parents, or they can do it without them being involved at all. And this is what happened. Because I didn't explicitly write consent for my mom and dad to be there, they weren't allowed in. But that makes it so that they couldn't help me, and they didn't get what was going on. So they spoke to the doctors themselves. And what they were told was that, well, this is just your child's identity. She's a boy, you're going to have to accept that, and you're going to have to let her do what she wants, because, well, the rates of suicide within the transgender community are incredibly high, and it's a common tactic for these doctors, for therapists, and for these activists to falsely misattribute these high statistics to a lack of either social acceptance or not medicalizing at an adequate time, which for these people means like intervening as early as possible, even at the detriment of importance, pubertal and psychological development.
Emotional blackmail.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, no parent wants to have the life of their child threatened.
Yeah. I'm just trying to understand, because then that was followed by at 13, where you were put on Lupron, I believe, and then shortly after testosterone too.
Yeah. And it was all like within like a half year
at 15.
Period.
Yeah. What is your parents' reaction, and where are your parents in all of this?
I mean,
as you're kind of going through this, because each step it kind of goes further and further. Are they getting concerned, or
Yeah,
I guess
absolutely.
obviously they're very concerned and they're just being emotionally blackmailed throughout this consistently. If you don't go on Lupron, then you're going to commit. If you don't go on testosterone, you're going to commit double mastectomy. Yeah, that's what they were talking about.
Unaddressed, or they go up depending on the procedure. And I was never before I was on these treatments. It wasn't until after I was about midway through my transition that I started to feel severely for the first time in my life. And especially during that post-transition period, I was experiencing so much grief as this little 16-year-old girl who had just lost her breasts that I thought that there was no future for me, and I wanted to. But during the whole process of this, my mom and dad were just, it was heartbreaking for them. They were basically watching me transform into a completely unrecognizable child. I went from this bubbly, fashionable, maybe slightly awkward but creative little girl to this kid who was just always out of sorts, always depressed, isolated, never really myself anymore. And they never believed I was a boy. They only said yes because they thought that my life could have been on the line. But they were watching me degenerate, watching me lose the light in my eyes over the years. And you can see it in some of my childhood photos during that time. I do not look happy. There's this darkness in my soul and just in my face. And my mom actually had a hunch that I was starting to regret my transition after I had surgery. But they weren't really allowed to question any of this by the doctors. They kept having the threat of my just pushed down their throats every single time that they expressed any sort of concern. And so when it came time for me to detransition, and when I started talking about the grief and everything I was going through at that time, they felt a lot of guilt. They felt like it was all in their hands, and they felt like they were manipulated. They felt like they were lied to, and they absolutely were by these doctors. But there also was a sense of hope of like, our daughter is not too far gone. And just watching me slowly heal over time and get better is something that has really helped us to rekindle our relationship, because it was very strained during that time. I was not happy. I was having mental health episodes. I was in a deep depression, and they didn't know if I was going to make it through it.
So at age 16 is when things started to turn around. Could you explain to me, I don't know whether you had an epiphany, what you read or realized that made you decide, oh crap, I'm doing the wrong thing and I need to make a big change now?
Yeah, so the surgery, I would say, was the major turning point, because it was just such a cruel thing for these doctors to inflict on me. It was just this permanent change to my body that there's no real going back from, either emotionally, psychologically, or physically. And the permanency of it really hit me maybe about like a month or so afterward. And I started going through the different stages of grief, but I couldn't really name exactly what these feelings were, because I was being led down this one-track path, with transition being presented as the only real option. I didn't know that detransition was a thing until I started considering it myself, because nobody had ever talked about it. Not even these doctors who were supposed to assess all of the risks and really just say no to me as a child. The thing that really got me out of it was the epiphany that I wanted to become a mother one day, that I wanted to have children of my own, naturally, and how terrifying it was that I potentially could have lost my ability to have biological children and safely carry a child to term without any risk of health effects for me or birth defects for my children. And when I learned in a class my junior year, just how beautiful things like nursing and breastfeeding are and how integral they are to the relationship between a mother and her infant, that broke me for a long time. I couldn't forgive myself. I felt like I was some monster, like I ripped something important away from my future children, and that I was going to be a terrible mother and a terrible woman. And it was hard for me to grapple with. It was incredibly difficult for me to grapple with. And just the horror of realizing everything that I went through at such a young age just haunted me. But in my choice to detransition, I started realizing the beauty of everything that I had. And I started to accept that there were some things that I may have lost forever, but also the fact that I probably would not be the young woman who I am today if I hadn't had these experiences, and that I could repurpose the pain that my family and I went through to help these other children, help these other young people and other families through their suffering and prevent this from ever happening again.
Have you ever followed up with or had any recourse with any of these doctors or psychologists who put you on the Lupron, the testosterone, the double mastectomy? What?
I tried. I went back to every single one of them, and they were incredibly unhelpful.
Wow.
It was like they were just looking at a big mistake they made and they didn't want to deal with it. That's the kind of attitude I felt I got from them, especially my surgeon. When I went back to him about a year later, talking about some of the complications I was experiencing and the regret, his response was, well, I mean, first of all, he actually gave me medical advice that gave me a skin infection. So that was kind of the nail in the coffin for my trust in any doctor for a very long time. I still have difficulty. I haven't seen like a general practitioner even, I think in like 3 or 4 years, because it's just, the idea of going back to an environment like that is deeply terrifying to me. But he also had this attitude of, well, we didn't expect you to regret this. I've never had this happen before. You know, I thought it was okay because we're a multidisciplinary practice and we had other doctors refer you, had letters of referral, so clearly there was some consultation there. And from the rest of my doctors, it was like, well, we've never had a patient like you before, so we don't know how to deal with you. And well, maybe you're still transgender, maybe you're non-binary, maybe you're not exactly a young man, but not a woman either. Isn't this just like another transition? Was one question I got from the woman who referred me to surgery. It was like they're trying to keep me in the mentality and in the process of transitioning in some way, so that I couldn't seek any recourse.
It'd make them feel a lot better about the mistakes they've made too.
And when they told me that I was the only one, well, it turned out not to be true. I know another girl who's had some of the exact same doctors as me, and she lives only about 30 minutes away from me. But also the way that they treat patients like us makes it so that they can't come back. And with the medical system, with how it is right now, there's no recognition of people like me at all.
When you say there's no way to come back, from the double mastectomy, you're saying it's permanent, of course.
Yeah.
There's no way to get...
I mean, there's no growing back breast tissue. Those scars are always going to be there. And with the way that they're performed, they're actually much more invasive than mastectomies that are performed on women who have breast cancer or who are at high risk of breast cancer. Those are usually done with a possible reconstruction in mind, and you like discuss in detail with doctors about potentially reversing it and your options for that. They don't do that. They just again, transition. These doctors who propel patients further down the path of transition, they're only thinking about it one way and never about reversal or regret or anything. And so I probably don't even have enough tissue or skin in my chest to get implants or another form of reconstruction, which I think I've decided not to, because not only because of that, but also because it's never going to bring back what I had. The form, the function, the nerve endings that once were there, it's all gone. And the only thing that I can do is just accept that there are things that I cannot change.
Since 16 is when you started your path of detransitioning, you're roughly 20 now.
Yeah.
What has your path of detransition been like, reclaiming your womanhood?
Well, the very beginning was the most difficult part. I was 16, going on 17, and going into my senior year. And you see, I passed as the opposite sex, so everybody who I went to school with, they thought that I was a young man. So for me to come back to school looking like, well, people thought that I was a transgender person. They thought that I was a young man who was identifying and trying to live as a woman, because not only because they knew me as a young man for years, but also because I had the appearance of a man. I had I know my voice sounds pretty feminine for what it is now, but I looked and sounded like a guy. So it was very awkward. Like, people often did not believe me when I would try to explain myself to them, or they would just like straight up make fun of me to my face.
Wow, it's kind of unimaginable because you actually, in my opinion, you look pretty feminine. So
Thank you.
you know.
It was very rough at first though, and I lost all my support, not only from my doctors, but also the support network that I had within the transgender community. People just either left me completely, or they started harassing me and telling me it was all my fault and that I should be ashamed of myself for even talking about it, that I was stupid, like a complete idiot for even thinking about it, even though these same people celebrated me the further that I went into it. And I lost pretty much all my friends at school. A lot of my best friends were moving out of town or out of school by this point. But most of my close friends who still were there, they didn't want to deal with me. I can't exactly blame them, because like we're all like 16, 17, 18 years old, and it's like, what do you do whenever one of your friends just becomes like incredibly deeply traumatized and basically can't function anymore? Like, I was so dysfunctional that I started giving up on my schoolwork, and I would like cry if I got like a bad grade. And I was in tears all the time and didn't know what to do about this. And it was something that was like really uncomfortable for them to deal with, and I don't think it was their responsibility to, but they also didn't want to deal with like the ideological changes I was going through, because since I was wrong about the transition, I started wondering like, what else am I wrong about? What else has the left lied to me about? And I would try to have these discussions with them, and it would make them upset, and they wanted nothing to do with me. So it was a very lonely period of my life. I actually ended up dropping out of school because it was like, I can't focus and nobody even wants me here, so why am I here? And I mean, I ended up getting a diploma equivalence. It was no problem, but there was this period of time where I was scrambling to find a new normal. And I was going through a bit of like a trial and error, trying to make new friends, trying to put myself out there, take myself out of my comfort zone. For a little while, I was basically a shut-in, just like playing video games on my bedroom floor every day and not doing anything useful. But I had this resolve to keep going. Like, as much as I wanted to genuinely just never go outside ever again, I felt like I had this responsibility to just keep going.
Absolutely. Your whole story is very powerful, and that's clearly what led you to become a spokesperson against different youth gender transitions that we're seeing right now. But you're not the only detransitioner. What's made you want to come out and be a lightning rod for this issue? I'm sure you've gotten a ton of pushback, threats as a result of your advocacy.
Oh, yeah.
What makes you want to become an advocacy and kind of pick up this mantle to prevent this from happening to others?
Well, there's a few main things that pushed me, I guess, motivated me to start speaking up publicly. And funnily enough, the first one of those would be the hatred that I got for initially talking about it online. Just on my personal social media. I wasn't like an advocate for anything. I wasn't like speaking publicly. I was just talking on private accounts that I had with a lot of my friends from school and transgender friends following me. And with how cruel people were to me, I had never been treated like that in my entire life. Like, I'd been bullied throughout a lot of my school years, but never that hard, and especially about something that was so personal and so deeply traumatic for me. And at first, I gave in and I stopped talking about it, and I apologized to people who did not deserve an apology, because I was a 16-year-old girl, and I didn't know any better, and I kept being told like I was going to harm the transgender community, that I was making a fool of myself just by talking about my experience, and I didn't want to harm anybody, and I didn't want to be an idiot, so I shut up for a bit. But then I started thinking about it on a more critical level, and it was like, they're giving me crap for just talking about the truth. I'm not saying anything other than the way that I feel and everything that I've experienced up to this point. I should be allowed to speak my piece. This is ridiculous. So I'm going to, little by little, start talking about this. And I also started encountering other detransitioners online as well. I wondered, I'd say like maybe about 2 weeks after I decided to detransition, I didn't even know that there was a word for it yet. I just kind of I thought I made it up in my head. I was trying to put it together and be like, okay, so I went through a transition, but then I stopped, so it's a detransition, right? Is there a word for this? Like, if I look this up, am I going to get results? And one of the first results I got was the official subreddit dedicated to detransitioning, and it was full of other people who had been through this experience as well. And I started interacting with these people, and honestly, it was one of the things at that time that kept me afloat and kept me encouraged to keep going and just never look back. And listening to my new friends and the pain that they were in, it was like, how can I stay quiet about this when I know that I'm not the only one who's been hurt? Just my experience is reason enough for me to speak up, but there's so many more people than we even realize who have been hurt by the same system. But how many of them are kids? Because I'd seen the other children in the gender clinics. I knew that there were other child transition patients, but where were they? All these people who I was speaking to, all the people who had spoken publicly about it at that point in time, they all did it after the age of 18. And I think one of the final pushes was, well, I had a few nieces and nephews come to the world by this point, and I'm the baby of the family. I never had to babysit. I never had to help take care, change diapers or anything. So I never had an outside perspective on things like innocence and the wonders of childhood until my older siblings started having kids of their own. And then it was like, this is precious, and children have to be defended at all costs. I don't want what happened to me to happen ever again. This is no place in my country. I believe that the United States is better than this, and I'm going to start talking about this. It started with a little Twitter account that I never thought would blow up the way that it did. I remember 2 weeks afterward, I was already at 8K, and then the J.K. Rowling was one of the first people who followed me. It was like, what in the world is happening? Why are so many people interested in this? I mean, I kind of had a feeling that people would be, because my story was unique, and I think something that, just one of the many perspectives that needs to be highlighted in order to make change on this issue. But I never thought that things would happen as quickly as they did, and I started getting... Are we just stopping? Cold stop?
No, yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, though, you have a very powerful story, and I admire and think it's very brave of you to continue to be an advocate for this stuff. And please continue the work that you do, despite all the pushback that you get. And quickly, in conclusion, was there anything else that you wanted to mention on this issue that you think people need to know?
A lot of people are afraid to activate on this issue because of the pushback that they might get, but I feel like culturally we're in a time where it's better than ever to enter the conversation. I think that everybody has a place in this discussion and in this fight to protect our children, because we all have a responsibility to advocate for the safety and the welfare of our children, as well as loving them the way that they are and meeting them where they are.
Absolutely. I think you're a very brave woman, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thanks.